picture of Papyrus 66, which is the world's oldest near-complete copy of the Gospel of John. It was discovered in 1952 near Dishna, Egypt, and today it's held at the Bodmer Library in Coligny, Switzerland. It's a codex, and it contains only the Gospel of John. And the scribe of the manuscript is notoriously unpredictable. There's about 450 corrections made to this world's oldest copy of the Gospel of John. The majority of the corrections are due to scribal error, but there are also dozens of alternate and often discussed readings that you might find in other important manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Washingtonianus or early church fathers. Another really important point about this manuscript that scholars have noticed is that it appears that the scribe had access to two different exemplars. That is, the scribe was copying, and the scribe was copying from one and correcting against the other. This is going to be important. Both of those earlier copies are lost to us. Papyrus 66 is the oldest one that we have, but as we're going to come back to this later, why it might be important that the scribe has access to two different copies. My study begins with chapter 11 of Papyrus 66. This is the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. And I know this is a presentation about Mary Magdalene. And so some of you are thinking, wait a second, the story of Lazarus and Mary and Martha, that's not Mary Magdalene. Just hold. We'll get to that point. I know that you've been taught this. This is going to shift some thinking on a few things. So this manuscript, Papyrus 66, has an intriguing set of variations around the names Mary and Martha in a sustained cluster of verses from John 11:1 through John 11:5. By looking at the idiosyncrasies in this manuscript and comparing them to the broader text transmission of the Gospel of John, my data has demonstrated that approximately 1 in 5 Greek manuscripts and 1 in 3 Old Latin manuscripts has some sort of textual problem around Martha. So 1 in 5 Greek manuscripts, and I think there's about 5,000 Greek manuscripts, so I've looked now at about 250. So I guess I can't speak for all 5,000. I've only looked at 250 of them. Of those 250 transcriptions that I've looked at, 1 in 5 of the Greek manuscripts has a problem around Martha, and 1 in 3 of the Old Latin manuscripts. I also looked at about 175 copies of the Gospel of Luke, because of course there's Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10 as well. 0% of those manuscripts have any sort of trouble in distinguishing between the two sisters, Maria and Martha. So I've concluded that this significant problem around Martha in the text transmission is not so much because the names Mary and Martha are similar. It's a phenomenon that is unique to the text transmission of John's Gospel. So what the study concludes is that it's possible that Martha was not present in the earliest circulating version of John's Gospel. And I'm going to show you why I got to that conclusion. Let's look at some of the more striking variants around Martha, especially in Papyrus 66. So let's look first of all at John 11 verse 1. The scribe originally wrote a nonsense reading. The scribe wrote, there was a certain sick man, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, and of Mary, his sister. Who here has taken Greek? Okay, there's some Greek readers here. For those of you who haven't, the word here that looks like Maria, well, it looks like Mapia, right? But this thing that looks like an M is a mu. This thing that looks like an A is an alpha. This thing that looks like a P is actually a rho. It's more like the R in Greek. This thing that looks like an I is the iota, and here's another alpha. So here's the word Maria, and then this is Mary and then you can see that the name Maria was written again, but the iota was erased, and it was changed to have a theta instead. In Greek, the theta represents TH. So by changing just one letter, the name Maria has been changed to Martha. The scribe also said Mary, his sister, and it has been changed to now say her sister. So it now says what your Bible says, the village of Mary and of Martha, her sister. And at any time, if you want to get out your Bible and compare it, or your phone, and you want to look up John 11 on your phone, you're welcome to do that, to see how these manuscript variants differ from what your Bible says. Now, I'm not the first person to look at this, and people had noticed that the scribe has done this change from Maria to Martha. And as I said, this scribe is often quite unpredictable, and scholars before me had said, probably the scribe just made an error and accidentally wrote the name twice and then fixes it. That would be more persuasive if we didn't see very similar editorial activity happening in another of the world's oldest gospel manuscripts of John. This is Codex Alexandrinus, copied around 400 CE and today held at the British Library. The scribe originally in this manuscript, you can see that there's been some crossing out here on the second line. You can see that these letters are smaller in the second line, and you can see that a word has been added, okay? Again, text critics before me, not me, had determined what was written, what was crossed out, and what it was changed to. The scribe originally wrote, "There was a certain sick man, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, his sister." That is a sensible reading. And you'll see that in a different way in this manuscript, Martha has been added. So basically, this second line probably said comes, that's the word for village. It looks as though that got erased and got added back here so that they could make room for the extra name. So now it says Mary and Martha. This used to say Maria. You can tell because the iota is hiding underneath. You can see again that the iota has been changed to a theta. Also, you can see that it said Mary, his sister, Maria tes adelphes autou, the masculine pronoun autou. But in this manuscript, the scribe decided not to change it. So there's three similarities between these manuscripts. First of all, Mary is the only sister mentioned, right? You only have Mary's name here. Second of all, it says that Mary is his sister. Third of all, the name Mary has been changed to Martha. That's happening in both of these manuscripts. It appears that Martha has been added to both of these in verse 1. Again, you could say, well, the names Mary and Martha are quite similar. So it's perhaps just different. And, his sister, her sister, potato, potato, like it doesn't really matter what the pronoun is. And again, I think that that's what a lot of text critics before me had thought. The problem is that when you get to John 11:3 in Papyrus 66, there is an undisputable change of meaning that cannot be explained by the habits of Papyrus 66's scribe. In this verse, one woman has been split in two. What the scribe originally wrote was, therefore, Maria, we don't know what the name is because all you can see is the row of her name. It's been really obviously scratched out. You can see that the alpha of her name has been sort of repurposed. The woman's name has been changed to say Hi Adelphi. Anybody who knows Greek, what does that mean? Hi Adelphi? The sisters. She had a name. The name is gone. Her name has been replaced with Hi Adelphi, the sisters. You also see that the singular verb apestilen, sent, has been changed to the plural. The epsilon has been changed to an alpha. So now it says they sent. Also, this participle legusa has been changed to legusai. There's this iota is the furthest to the right of all the letters in the margin. And so again, text critics before me have said that we think that this has been added. So what the scribe originally wrote was, therefore Maria sent to him saying, singular verbs, but it has been corrected to say, therefore the sisters sent to him saying, which of course matches what your Bible will say today. This is a super interesting change, and it's interesting that we don't find it only in Papyrus 66, but we find something similar in the first printing of the King James Bible. Again, it's not just in Papyrus 66 that we get these problems. And so you can see that in the first printing of the King James Bible, it says his sister sent. And the second printing of the King James Bible says his sisters. So if somebody says that they are King James only, I always say to them, which King James? The first printing or the second printing or the one you're holding in your hand? Which is the one that you mean? Because there's inconsistency on whether there are one or two sisters, not only in the first printing and the second printing of the King James Bible, but also in the first transcription and the corrected transcription of the world's oldest copy of this verse. So whether there's one or two sisters in this verse depends upon the manuscript and sometimes even upon the transcription. This is a really fun one for those of you who read Greek. We're still in Papyrus 66. So this has to do with this word here, this alpha upsilon tau eta. It's a pronoun, It's a feminine singular pronoun, but depending upon how it is accented, it could either be the dative feminine singular or the nominative feminine singular. So, of course, these very old manuscripts did not include accent marks. We're going to be looking at some later manuscripts down the line that do have accent marks, but around the turn of the 3rd century when this was copied, there were no accent marks. So we don't actually know for certain whether this was the dative feminine singular or the nominative feminine singular. So the best way that I can explain this to people who don't read Greek is I suggest that it's sort of like in English, you have certain words that are spelled the same but have 2 different meanings. For instance, if I were to say grin and bear it, that is spelled the same, but it doesn't mean the same thing as watch out for that bear, right? B-E-A-R. The same word can have different meanings depending upon how it's used in the sentence. So there is a small correction here, this sort of comma-like thing. It's called a hypodiastole, but let's just call it a comma. And text critics before me had noticed this, and they said, we don't know why the scribe has added this. And I looked at it and I said, I'm pretty sure I know why. Because the text originally said, when Jesus heard, he said to her. Aute is in the dative feminine singular. You can tell because there's a little space after the word indicating that Jesus is about to start talking. When Jesus heard, he said to her, the sickness is not unto death, but it is for the glory of God, in order to glorify the Son through it. So this word aute, when it is in the dative feminine singular, it means to her. But when it is in the nominative feminine singular, this is a big plug to take a Greek class, okay? When it is in the nominative feminine singular, it means this. It is accented as haute. So what the scribe has done is by adding this hypodiastole, it forces a break in the text. So now, instead of it saying, when Jesus heard, he said to her, it says, when Jesus heard, he said, comma, this sickness is not unto death. This sort of erases the possibility that Jesus is talking to just one woman. Remember, this is literally one verse after the scribe has just split a woman in 2. That's definitely what's happened here. The scribe has changed the meaning of the aute from dative feminine singular to the haute, the nominative feminine singular. And then finally we get to John 11, verse 5, which is pretty similar to what your Bible will say. For the first time you see Martha present in the base text. It says, Jesus loved Martha, and Martha is named here. You can see her name. It's very clear. It hasn't been corrected. This is the first time in 5 verses of text that there's no question that Martha belongs. Remember that in verse 1, there was this sort of hesitation. Is it Maria or Martha that's named here? And also a woman was definitely split in 2 in verse 3. There's sort of an erasure of the possibility of Jesus speaking to one woman in verse 4. But here she is. Martha is finally there. This is where I think that it might matter that the scribe has access to 2 exemplars. My theory is that the scribe has one copy of the Gospel of John with just Lazarus and Mary, and a different copy of the Gospel of John with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. If so, that could explain all of these textual corrections, because you can see that it's sort of like, okay, is there one woman or 2? Are they both named Mary? Like Martha's sort of getting added, a woman's getting split in 2. Like there's a sort of question of how you should use the aute or haute, is it nominative or dative? But in John 11:5, the scribe has to make a decision. Am I going to copy from the version with just one sister or the copy with 2 sisters? And in fact, I think that this little dot here, now, of course, maybe the scribe just had to go to the bathroom. It's totally, I mean, this is, I don't know what happened 1800 years ago when this was copied, but it is strange that the scribe stops in the middle of a word. The word is igapa. The scribe begins to write and then stops. And I think it's possible that this is the moment where the scribe decides, I'm going to copy from the exemplar that has 2 sisters, because there was a stop right before it. Why would the scribe only write 1 letter? The scribe stops. And that's because if you look at the text transmission of John 11, this verse is completely unstable. It could say, I have now cataloged at least a dozen different readings of what this verse could say. So you can actually see that Papyrus 66 has its own unique transcription. It says, Jesus loved Martha and the sister and Lazarus. That's not quite what your Bible says. Your Bible says Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. The scribe has hesitated on identifying Martha as Mary's sister. Jesus loved Martha and the sister and Lazarus. However, there is a marginal note. See this little thing that looks kind of like a division sign? This is a text critical sign that suggests that different manuscripts say different things. And you can see down here in the margin, very hesitantly, the scribe adds autes, specifying that Mary is Martha's sister. So the correction, the alternate exemplar reading, Jesus loved Martha and the sister of her and Lazarus, which is in fact what your Bible would say today. So that the corrected text is what your Greek critical edition would say. But as I said, John 11:5 is an extraordinarily unstable verse. Let's start looking at some of the other readings that we might find. This is Codex Corbiensis. It's a 5th century Old Latin manuscript held by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Does anybody know what the Old Latin manuscripts are? And perhaps a better question is, has anybody heard of the Vulgate? Everybody's heard of the Vulgate. Okay, who translated the Vulgate? St. Jerome. Does anybody know when he translated the Vulgate? Yeah, the end of the 4th century, right. But Christianity was around before the end of the 4th century, right? So what did Latin-speaking people do when they needed to read the gospel that had been authored in Greek? There was some people who were maybe not as fancy scholars as St. Jerome who took it upon themselves to translate the text from Greek to Latin. And so it's maybe not as polished. But these manuscripts, these old Latin manuscripts, of which something like a couple dozen survive today, these are some of the world's most precious manuscripts for trying to reconstruct the text of the New Testament. Because even though the manuscript might be from the 5th century, the fact that it's an old Latin translation tells you that the translation was made from a 2nd or 3rd century Greek copy. So those 2nd and 3rd century Greek copies are lost to us. Papyrus 66 is the oldest one that we have. But whoever made this translation was translating from a Greek copy that was copied in the 2nd or 3rd century. So interestingly, the scribe writes a completely different version of the verse, which may be based on a Greek text that we don't have access to anymore. Jesus loved Lazarus and Mary and her sister, okay? This is very strange because unlike your Bible, who's listed first? Lazarus, right? Who's supposed to be listed first? Martha, right? Your Bible will say that Martha's listed first, but this manuscript lists Lazarus first. Also, the second person is still Mary, but usually Mary doesn't get named. It's usually Martha and her sister and Lazarus. I do encourage you to have your John 11 out if you want it on your phone. This manuscript, Mary is second, but her name is included. And then it says, and her sister Martha is not named at all. That is a completely different text form than what your Bible says today. This is not what manuscripts of the Bible are supposed to look like. You're not supposed to just sort of arbitrarily decide who's first in the list, arbitrarily decide who gets named and who isn't. This is extremely unstable. You can also see that a later hand has added Martha's name. This is a Carolingian minuscule. This is from at least 300 years later after this 5th century uncial script. So this is telling you that some later reader is looking at John 11 and they're saying, wait a second, John 11:5, Martha's name is supposed to be in there. So they stick Martha's name in. This is showing you that multiple text forms of this verse were circulating in antiquity and that somebody felt the need to correct this manuscript. There are also manuscripts where there's just one sister. This is Codex Colbertinus, another old Latin manuscript also held by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. This manuscript just says Jesus loved Lazarus and his sister. So, and then there's a lot of other text forms that I haven't even shown you. Oftentimes Mary is listed first, especially in the Coptic transmission and Family 1. Sometimes Martha's not named at all. Sometimes a lot of old Latin manuscripts say Jesus loved Lazarus and his sisters. This verse is completely unstable. So the first thing that I want to point out about this. It looks as though there's something going on with Martha, right? Something funny is going on with Martha in the text transmission. What I think is the biggest finding of my Harvard Theological Review article is that using just 3 manuscripts, 3 really important manuscripts of the Gospel of John, you can completely reconstruct the text of John 11 without Martha. This is not a conjectured text. Conjectured text is when you sort of dream up something that you think what might have been the case, or maybe wishful thinking, or maybe conspiracy theories, like I think that maybe somebody wrote this in the Bible and somebody changed it. These are actual real readings found. They are crossed out readings, but they are real readings found in some of the world's most important gospel manuscripts, Papyrus 66, Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Colbertinus. So if you have John 11 on your phone, or if you have a Bible in your lap, I encourage you to read along. I'm going to read this reconstruction. I'm suggesting that this may be an earlier text form of John 11. And I'm going to read it to you, and you can compare it and see how it is different from the text of what your Bible says today. There was a certain sick man, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, his sister. Now this was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore Mary sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, the one you love is sick. But when Jesus heard, he said to her, the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Lazarus and his sister. That is a sensible text form, and it's substantial. In case you think it's only happening at the beginning of the Gospel of John, literally throughout the entire text transmission, you can find these kinds of corrections happening and these kinds of these strange manuscript variants. This is the same manuscript that says Jesus loved Lazarus and his sister, Codex Colbertinus. If you want to change the name Maria to Martha in Latin, this is how you do it. You change the I to a T, you put a little crossbar, and you put an H above it. So this is how you do it in Latin. You can tell that it didn't originally say Marta because the I's are thick and straight, and the T's are narrow and curved, narrow to thick and curved. So this was not a T, it was an I, and it got changed to a T. The name Maria has been changed to Martha in John 11:20. This is a manuscript. I had already published this article. I was already giving presentations like the one I'm giving to you now when I came to Duke. And Duke has a really wonderful Greek collection of Greek manuscripts. And I said, I want to look at the Greek gospel manuscripts and see if there's anything around Mary and Martha. So I started looking. Guess what? The 5th one that I looked at had a Mary change to Martha, because as I said, it's happening throughout the entire text transmission. 1 in 5 Greek manuscripts has a problem around Martha. I didn't even have to look very far. I just walked on Duke's campus, I looked at 5 manuscripts, and I found one. So you can see here that this was a Maria, because you can see this one does have accent marks. The accent on the iota has been erased. The theta is very narrow and it's off center. The theta is supposed to look like this, right? Also, this little line is sort of like a nomen sacrum, indicating that it's a saint. And when it's Martha's name, the line is like on the right side, but when it's Maria's name, the line is on the left side. This is definitely a Maria change to Martha. This is in John 11, verse 21. A lot of people think, well, now come on, we know that Martha's the one who serves. Who's going to serve the supper in this version, this purported version? And again, I say, which manuscript? Because I know at least a half a dozen minuscules where Mary is the one who serves the supper, and then she anoints Jesus in John chapter 12. So at this point, you're probably wondering, what is going on? Why would somebody want to add Martha to the story? So I'm basically suggesting that it's possible that someone who is an early reader of Luke's gospel, which has these 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, you all know this story, right? Martha is cooking and Jesus visits and Mary's sitting at his feet, and Martha's like, tell my sister to help me. And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, Mary's chosen the better part. It won't be taken from her. Everybody knows this story. Has anybody ever noticed that they don't have a brother? Has anybody ever noticed that this is in Luke chapter 10, which is literally 1 chapter after Jesus starts walking to Jerusalem? Luke 9 is when Jesus starts walking on the road to Jerusalem, which means that he's still in Galilee or Samaria at this point. This is very far in the north. I'm suggesting that Martha and Mary in Galilee or Samaria are a completely different family than Lazarus and Mary, who are in Bethany outside Jerusalem. But some early copyists wanted to suggest that Lazarus's sister Mary was the same person as Martha's sister Mary. But if Martha is not present in John chapter 11, something has to be pointed out. There is no real reason to connect the Lazarus story with this story in Luke. There's no reason to do so if Martha is not there. In fact, with only Mary present in this Lazarus story, I believe readers would be far more likely to connect the Lazarus story to John chapter 20. This is a story of a woman named Mary who's at a tomb, who's crying, who sees somebody rise from the dead. Not only that, but several specific Greek words are emphasized. You know this. This is the story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene together in the garden at the culminating point of John's gospel, which, by the way, is also written by the same author as the Lazarus story. I'm suggesting that some editor might have interfered with the evangelist's intention to suggest that Lazarus' sister Mary is similar to Mary Magdalene. Let's look at these exact textual parallels. Obviously, the word Mary is the same in both chapters. She's crying in both chapters. Here's a really interesting one. In John chapter 11, Jesus says, "Where have you laid him?" Talking about Lazarus. "Pou tethekate auton." In John chapter 20, Mary Magdalene asks sort of a mirror question to Jesus. When she thinks that he's the gardener, she says, "I do not know where you have laid him." Pou ethekas auton. It's the exact same verb and the exact same pronoun. There's obviously a tomb in both stories. There's a stone in both stories. There's a very rare Latin loan word in both stories, sudarion. That's the word for handkerchief. They take the handkerchief off of Lazarus in John chapter 11, and then in John chapter 20, they look inside the empty tomb and the handkerchief is rolled up. It's a very rare word. So if you were reading the Gospel of John, maybe not the first time, but maybe on the second or the third time, you might notice, wait a second, like a stone and a tomb and a handkerchief, and where have you laid him? And there's a woman named Mary and she's crying. Like, it's just, it seems as though there's a lot of similarities and there's so many textual parallels. It doesn't seem as though it's an accident. Here's another really interesting fun fact. So there's mention of my brothers. Jesus says to Mary Magdalene, "Go to my brothers." And Martha and Mary are very focused on their brother. Has anybody ever noticed that Martha and Mary say an identical quote? In John, you've noticed that? John 11:21, Martha says, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." John 11:32, Mary says, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." It's literally an identical textual quote. People who studied source criticism know that oftentimes when you see a duplication like that, source critics theorize that that might have been a place where the text was edited. So I'm suggesting that that duplicate quote is an indication of a doubled sister. And of course, John chapter 12, Mary anoints Jesus, and Jesus says, "Leave her alone. She might keep it for the day of my burial." How many women named Mary go to the tomb in John's gospel? Just one, Mary Magdalene, right? These are not, I'm not saying that the author of John has explicitly identified Lazarus' sister Mary as Mary Magdalene, but has certainly left a lot of subtle suggestions so that the question is at least going to be in your head. Is Lazarus' sister Mary Magdalene? When you're reading John 11, you're going to be making those connections with John chapter 20. But people don't do that. The reason why is because Lazarus' sister Mary is paired with Martha. So instead, you are distracted into a different gospel with a different evangelist's intention. Martha is sort of like a decoy. I'm suggesting that she has been editorially added to ensure that the reader does not identify Lazarus' sister Mary as Mary Magdalene. Instead, no, she's that other Mary. She's that Mary who's so nice and quiet, who sits at Jesus' feet. Martha and Mary, you remember them, and you're like, "Oh, I love Martha and Mary." And then like you're like, "Oh, they've got their little sibling rivalry." And so then your attention is completely distracted. It's very efficient. It works very well. So basically, I'm suggesting, is it possible that early Orthodox Christians who are copying the text are specifically wishing to deflect attention away from the woman who spoke with Jesus at Lazarus's tomb and her similarities with the Mary of John chapter 20. By the simple addition of Martha, by the change of an iota to a theta, the reader of the Lazarus story is instead subtly urged to identify Mary of Bethany with the woman who sat at Jesus's feet in Luke 10. But here's the real kicker. Who utters the Christological confession in John's gospel? Do you know that offhand? You probably know the words, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives in me and believes me will never die. Do you believe this? You've heard Jesus say that. And you know the confession, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. Offhand, would you know who says that confession? It's Martha. Martha gives the confession. But she's sort of a minor character who says the central confession. Did you know that one of the earliest people to comment on this passage, Tertullian, said that Mary uttered the Christological confession? Every single copy of Against Praxeus says that Mary confessed Jesus to be the Son of God. Imagine a Gospel of John, where upon the second or third read, you think Lazarus' sister Mary is probably Mary Magdalene, or she might be. And then you're like, this woman named Mary confesses Jesus is the Christ. She anoints Jesus. She stands by him at the cross. She goes by herself to the empty tomb. She gets the first appearance of the risen Jesus, and she gets the first apostolic commission. That is a very important character. That is a central character in the Gospel of John. That is a threatening character, especially for those who are focused on Peter's confession in Matthew's Gospel, which is very comparable. Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. He gets a big reward for that, right? He gets the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever he binds on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever he looses on earth will be loosed in heaven. Basically, I'm suggesting that the author of John subtly set it up so that Mary, probably Mary Magdalene, had a similar authoritative role in John's gospel as Peter did in Matthew's gospel. And that readers and copyists of the Gospel of John understood what was happening, and they say, So they source Martha from Luke's gospel, they add her to John's gospel, and now you have a forgettable character uttering the central confession in this gospel. Still a woman, so you've got some sort of, maybe that's how it can be justified. You still got a woman uttering the Christological confession, but it's not Mary Magdalene, right? Mary Magdalene is no longer a threat. She has been split in three. So I suggest that Papyrus 66 is reflecting the final stages of a form of the fourth gospel where Martha was being added to the resurrection story of Lazarus. And I think there is a strong possibility that the change was made to hamper the text's subtle identification of Mary of Bethany with Mary Magdalene. And perhaps in particular, it was to ensure that John 11:27's crucial Christological confession would not be on Mary Magdalene's lips. So this was my major conclusion in the Harvard Theological Review article, which was published in 2017, and I'm very glad that it's getting a lot of traction and that people are thinking about it. It's getting cited in commentaries now. I was lucky enough to be able to meet with the Nestlé Hollande editors in 2019, I think it was. And so I'm hoping that there might be some changes made to the apparatus of the Nestlé Hollande 29th edition that make it a little bit clearer that there is a major textual problem in John 11. And of course, I have not proven that Martha has been added to the Gospel of John. I have simply made a competitively plausible hypothesis for the very strange data that we see in the manuscripts, the very strange manuscript variants. So this is the first article that was the text critical article that I published in 2017. And of course, my next question is, oh wait, I also have to show you there's a lot of early artwork with just one sister. A lot of sarcophagi, most of them have only one sister. This reliquary, just one sister. This is like a based. This is the Andrews diptych. It's based on a 5th century piece of artwork. There's only one sister because I'm pretty sure that's not Martha. Only one sister. So It's fun because the more time I spend with this, the more I find. It's not as though I found this idea and also I wrote a song about Mary Magdalene, and that's what started me onto this. Like I wrote a song about Mary Magdalene, and then I found Papyrus 66, and now I found this, and it keeps going. And here I am at Vanderbilt. Hi, thanks for coming to my talk. Is anybody in here a songwriter? No, but there are a lot of songwriters in Nashville, right? So it's kind of fun to be in like a city. I just saw some musician friends of mine today, so it was really nice to be here. But it's just such a strange trajectory to see that, you know, writing a song led to something that might be real. There might have been an editorial change to John's gospel. So my next question, of course, is, well, if Mary Magdalene is the problem, we should look at other places where Mary Magdalene is in the text and see if there's other textual problems. And the answer is yes. There are other places where Mary Magdalene's presence seems to cause nodes of textual instability. And this is the second article, the second text critical article that just came out a couple of months ago. It's called Rabboni, which means Lord. And it was published in TC, a journal of biblical textual criticism. And it was co-written with Brandon Simonson of Boston University, who is a Hebraicist and an Aramaicist, which I am not. So this is a co-write. And this was, if we go back to the story of John 20, the encounter between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, this is about this section of the text. Jesus says, Mary, she turns and says to him, Rabboni, which means teacher is what your Bible will say, right? But again, it depends on the manuscript. So we're going to look at this. Why does it matter so much what Mary says and how the word Rabboni is translated? Well, a lot of modern commentators, such as Raymond Brown and Karen King, have pointed out that when Mary calls Jesus teacher, it suggests that she has not a very high level of understanding. Raymond Brown suggests one is tempted to theorize that by using the teacher title, the Magdalene is showing her misunderstanding that this, like the risen Jesus that's talking to her. So teacher is kind of a low title. It's what Nicodemus calls Jesus, right? And in John chapter 1, the first disciples to encounter Jesus, the former disciples of John the Baptist, they call Jesus teacher as well. So it suggests that she's kind of reverted. You know, it's at the end of the gospel, but she's showing a really low level of understanding. Karen King similarly says she addresses him as teacher, indicating a relatively low standing on the hierarchical scale of Johannine Christological titles. You also get church fathers like Eusebius and Jerome saying, look how dumb Mary is. They're basically saying like her insight is so limited compared to the male apostles. The males had so much better faith because, you know, they understood who Jesus was, and this silly woman like thinks he's just her teacher. So this teacher translation has been used both in antiquity and in modern times to argue that Mary Magdalene doesn't really understand who's in front of her at that moment when Jesus calls her name. This is of course important because the Good Shepherd narrative, when Jesus calls people by name, they know who is calling them. But if she only kind of knows, she only halfway knows, you know, is Mary really one of Jesus's own if she doesn't really understand who he is? If she just thinks that she's a teacher and she doesn't really understand that he's the risen Lord? But it turns out that there are different readings in different manuscripts. So unfortunately, Papyrus 66 has a lacuna here. There's a hole in the manuscript, as does Papyrus 45 and Papyrus 75. Too bad. Those are the three most substantial ancient copies of the Gospel of John. But we do have an Oxyrhynchus papyrus. Does anybody know about the Oxyrhynchus? Oh, it's this awesome trash heap in Egypt that had like hundreds of thousands of like manuscript fragments, and that's where we got the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas, like pieces of them, the Greek fragments. In addition to the Nag Hammadi and the Berlin Codex versions. Sorry, I'm going off into manuscript. I love manuscripts, obviously. This is my favorite thing. So this is an Oxyrhynchus papyrus found in Egypt by Grenfell and Hunt. And this is one of the first manuscripts that they published. So in this, it is, you can see here's like sort of a bigger picture of it here. You can see it's fairly substantial, but it's got some holes in it, but it is definitely John chapter 20 here. And you can see that when you get to John 20, verse 16, this is what the text is supposed to say. You know, sir, if you have carried him, tell me where you've laid him and I will take him. Jesus says, Mary, turning, she says, Rabboni, which means, all right. So you have the beta from Rabboni. You can see the beta here, right? And you can see the mu from Memu Haptu, it could either be from the me or the mu, right? But this part here, if you were to write out the whole transcription, there's actually not enough room in the text for the word didaskale. And I'm, again, not the person who's pointed this out. Grenfell and Hunt pointed this out immediately. And today, Blumel and Wayment, who are the big papyrologists today, they say the same thing. And David Parker and Peter Head, all the best text critics, they're saying there's not enough room in this papyrus for the word didaskale. So nearly everyone conjectures that the word here is probably Kyrie, Lord. And the reason that matters is because two of our oldest Latin manuscripts say Lord. They say, she said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni quod dicitur Domine, which means Lord. And there's no magister, there's no teacher here at all. Codex Vercellensis, which is 4th century, our oldest Latin copy of this, of John's Gospel, and Codex Usurianus Primus, both just say Rabboni, which means Lord. I don't know why Karen King doesn't know about this reading, or Sandra Schneider's, and I don't know why Raymond Brown doesn't pay any attention to it. This is why text critics, we need to go out and say, guys, like there's manuscript variants that say different things. So, and especially when people make arguments that, you know, that exegetically Mary Magdalene doesn't have a level of understanding. Which manuscript? Mary understands perfectly well in this manuscript. She says, Lord. Also, Codex Beze, which is kind of a strange manuscript. It has a lot of unique readings, but it says Kyrie didaskale. It has both, Lord, teacher. This suggests a conflated reading because some manuscripts said Lord and some manuscripts said teacher. Maybe it's because one of the readings was original and then somewhere along the way, the text was edited. You could make an argument in either direction for whichever one is the original one, but this does seem to be the product of some manuscript that said teacher, some manuscript that said Lord, and so the scribe's like, I'll just put them both in, right? Because you don't want to lose anything. And that happens on both the Greek and the Latin sides of Codex Beze. I wish I could spend more time with you on this. I only have a couple of minutes left, but Codex Beze and several other old Latin manuscripts do include the word Lord here. And you also get a lot of church fathers, such as Hippolytus of Rome and Augustine. They refer to this verse where Mary just says, Lord. So the conclusion that we had to this section of the paper is that what's going on here is whether Mary's utterance of the word Rabboni indicates that she's faithful or that she has misunderstanding. It actually depends on how you translate the word. The translation has real consequences for our perceptions of how much insight she has at this climactic moment of John's gospel, right? When the risen Jesus appears. Does Mary understand, or is she not very smart, right? Maybe some of you have written papers on this section and you've had to explain why Mary's using the word teacher. I really hope that this paper makes it out there so that people can, in their exegesis, talk about, you can exegete multiply. You can exegete, if she says teacher, it's this. If she says Lord, it's this. It really depends upon the manuscript. And I'll just talk about one other fantastic, very interesting manuscript reading, which is that in some manuscripts, there's an extra half verse where Mary Magdalene runs to touch Jesus, okay? So usually it says Rabboni, which means, he says Mary, and she says Rabboni, which means teacher, and he says, do not touch me, right? Me mu haptu, touch me not. But a lot of manuscripts have this extra piece that say, kai procedramen absastai autu, and she ran to touch him, which is this, this has real consequences because if it says, and she ran to touch him, which is in the present imperative, when he says me mu haptu, that is in the present imperative, which suggests that it's already happening. This means that Mary Magdalene is the first to touch the risen Jesus in John's gospel, not Thomas, right? Again, major exegetical consequences. And you don't just get it in Codex Sinaiticus, it's in the corrected text, which is probably from the 6th or 7th century. You also get it in some old Latin texts. Again, this is a little, they show up in later manuscripts, but you do actually get it also in the Syriac Sinaitic palimpsest, which is a 4th century manuscript, and Cyril of Alexandria has it in his text, which is 5th century. So this is really circulating, it's an extra half verse, and it seems to have also made it into some artwork. The Bernward Gospels has an image of Mary actually touching Jesus. She is touching Jesus, right? So basically the big conclusion after doing this major study of all the manuscripts of John chapter 20 is that we have 4 different narratives, 4 different stories, depending upon which manuscript you're reading. There's the one that your Bible will say, Rabboni, which means teacher, right? But sometimes Mary understands a little bit better and she says Rabboni, which means Lord, right? That's probably what Papyrus 5 said, and it's definitely what Codex Vercellensis says. Sometimes Rabboni means teacher and Lord. That's what happens in Codex Bezae. And sometimes she says Rabboni, which means teacher, and she runs to touch him, which happens in Codex Sinaiticus. These are 4 different stories. If you were a filmmaker filming this epic moment where the risen Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, you would have to film it 4 different times because these are 4 different narratives. These are 4 different screenplays. So the point is that there is something about Mary Magdalene's presence. Let's just say something about Mary in the text. There's something about Mary that causes textual anxiety, resulting in multiplicity in the text transmission, which I think results in the requirement, the responsibility of New Testament exegetes to interpret multiply. I think if you're writing a sermon, which I hope some of you will, or if you're writing an exegesis paper, or if you're just talking about this, or you're writing about it, if you're a scholar and you're going to write about it, I hope that you will acknowledge these manuscript variants, because for the people who read these manuscripts, this was the Bible. They didn't know that, some other manuscript had a different story. This was their Bible. So the Bible that we've inherited is multiple. So that is my presentation, and I wanted to say thank you so much again to Dean Armour, and especially to Beth for all of her enthusiasm in having this happen, and also to Shatika. And I am happy to take some questions, and thank you so much to everybody on Zoom for showing up as well. It's such a great turnout. Oh, I've got a little newsletter that I'm going to pass around, and you can type it into the chat if you want to. The reason that Beth knows that I was publishing more is because she's on my newsletter. So if you want updates, please sign up.
So are there questions?
Hello, and thank you for this wonderful presentation, very illuminating. My question is, I'm Johnny, by the way, and I'm a first-year MTS student.
Nice to meet you.
And I wonder, do you think that suppression was the result of some toxic toxic patriarchy, or is that the sense that there might have been something inappropriate, or there might have been a perception of something inappropriate in the relationship with Jesus and Mary Magdalene that they sort of wanted to erase from the biblical tradition?
As far as the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that's something that unfortunately cannot be historically recovered. I think that you can make the argument that something about Mary's authority created textual anxiety because we have so many apocryphal texts, such as the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia, and Logian 114 of the Gospel of Thomas, which probably, a lot of people have argued that that's Mary Magdalene, and sometimes it says Magdalene and sometimes it's just Mary, but Peter seems to have a problem with her. There seems to be something about Mary's voice and her authority that is problematic. So when text critics look at textual variations, we have to try to provide like sort of a historical explanation for why this might be happening. And to me, this is the obvious best explanation. We have these later texts, later than the Gospel of John, that suggest some sort of anxiety about Mary Magdalene's authority and about her place with Jesus, like whether he loved her more than all the other disciples, which is what the Gospel of Mary says, or that she's his companion, which is what the Gospel of Philip says. Whatever the source of it is, she's creating some sort of anxiety. And so whether it's toxic patriarchy, that's, it was certainly a patriarchal society at that time. I would mainly just say we have evidence of second century documents that suggest that there's a lot of anxiety, particularly around Mary Magdalene. And so I would frame it that way. I would say whatever the reason was, toxic or not, Mary Magdalene causes anxiety in Orthodox circles. And so that may be an explanation for why we're seeing this sort of editorial activity. It's one of many explanations. Well, not many, but one of a couple plausible ones. Yeah.
I don't need the mic. I'm good.
Maybe for the Zoom people, would it be good for the Zoom people to have the mic?
Maybe, yeah. I'm Jacob Gambrell. I'm a third year MDiv student. Thank
Nice
you
to
so
meet you.
much for coming. It was super interesting.
Thank
I learned a ton. I'm kind of curious with the number of Mary characters,
Hmm.
kind of in the New Testament more broadly, and then in particular in the Gospel of John.
Hmm.
I was just looking it up. There's also a Mary, the wife of Clopas,
Mary of Clopas,
who's
yes.
at
Mhm.
at the crucifixion.
Mhm.
So I just would love if you could kind of walk through maybe what the like the standard number of Marys is, and maybe if you would argue some of those Marys are the same Mary, or there's actually more Marys than that, and just kind of walk us through that.
That's a very difficult question. How many Marys are in the New Testament? I mean, Jerome said that there was only 4. But I'm suggesting that first of all, Jesus' mother is not named in the Gospel of John. We assume that her name is Mary from information we get from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John's Gospel, I'm suggesting that there's a grand total of 2 Marys. That is Lazarus' sister Mary, who may well be Mary Magdalene, and Mary of Clopas. Jesus' mother historically was probably called Mary, but John does not identify her as such. And you could even argue that it's possible that editorially John decided not to mention Jesus' mother's name because John wanted to amplify the parallelism between Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene. You could argue that. But Mary of Clopas is still there. So, but I don't think anybody is going to think that Mary of Clopas was Lazarus' sister. In John's Gospel, I think that there's only 2 Marys, whereas most people today, if you count Jesus' mother, then there's 3. Sorry, it gets so complicated. And I do think that Mary and Martha were historical people. I'm not suggesting that Martha didn't exist. I'm just saying that she's a Lucan character and that Martha and Mary are a totally different family. As for Mary of James and Joseph, that's another prickly question because Jesus has brothers named James and Joseph. So is Mary the mother of, is that his mother? I mean, so it's a question that is unfortunately unanswerable. But I'm also saying that part of the problem might have been editorial activity in the text transmission.
So you would say the only other non-Mary Magdalene Mary in the book of John would be the one line
Mary of Clopas.
Every other Mary.
I'm saying you can't make that argument because of the textual parallelism, not just because I like Mary Magdalene. I'm sure a lot of people, oh, you wrote a song about Mary Magdalene. Like, well, yeah, but at the same time, I got published in a peer-reviewed journal. So, I mean, there's some substance to it. There are those textual parallels between John 11 and John 20. Hi, Claire.
Hi. So I know because of having Beth in my ear all semester that you also, and I know you don't really have time to talk about it, but that you also have published about Mary's Magdalene being an epithet and not necessarily a geographical marker. I'm wondering if you could just
Absolutely.
the short Reader's Digest version of that for us.
Sure, and I'm going to be actually presenting on that at thefuturechurch.org, I think on April 28th, so that's in just a few weeks. If you want to sign up on my mailing list, I'll send you a link. I'm going to be co-presenting with Joan Taylor, who's the co-author. Basically, the word Migdol means tower in Aramaic. The question is, does Mary come from the town called Tower, or is Mary herself the tower? And what this article, it's a JBL article from 2021, we basically survey the patristic record and what church fathers had to say about it, and they were completely divided. Nobody agreed. Some people think that she came from a place called Magdala, but they didn't know where it was. Nobody actually identifies her as coming from a place by the Sea of Galilee. You know, has anybody been to the Holy Land and been to Migdol, where they found these synagogues? Okay, well, if you go to the Holy Land, they're going to take you to Magdala, and they're going to show you the synagogue. This is where Mary Magdalene was born. But nobody ever said that she came from that place until the 6th century. So to say that Mary of Magdala comes from this location, it's sort of wishful thinking, especially from evangelicals who like having a place to archaeologically excavate, to historically verify that the Bible is true. That's what that serves when you say Mary from Magdala. You're serving this sort of desire for an archaeological dig. But we have other church fathers who say, Jerome says that it means she's a tower. She's the tower of faith. Eusebius thinks that there are 2 Mary Magdalenes. He thinks that there's two of them. And he says that there is a place called Magdala, but she's not from there. And it's in Judea, which is in the south. A guy named Macarius Magnus says that she comes from a place that nobody has even heard of, like a forgettable village. The point is that if you look at the earliest, and also the rabbis think that it means she's a hairdresser. So because there's no consensus in antiquity, how can we as scholars today say that we know for certain what her name means? There's diversity in antiquity, and it could mean one of several things, but it is the earliest person to when Luke says Maria he kalumene Magdalene, Mary called Magdalene, the way that Luke uses the word kalumene, called, is usually when he's doing epithets. So if there's an example of, I don't know, we give something like 10 examples where throughout Luke and Acts, whenever Luke uses this word kalumene, it's always like Simon the Black, or like, or called Peter, or it's always some sort of, or Martha had a sister called Mary. When Luke is talking about people from a specific location, he uses a different formulation. So because Luke is the oldest of the people who have this sort of interesting way of talking about Mary Magdalene, all the others say Maria he Magdalene. She's just Mary the Magdalene, but Luke switches it. He says Mary called Magdalene. He's the only one who has this weird formulation, and he matches that called with epithets throughout the gospel, throughout Luke and Acts. So we're saying, well, Luke is the oldest one of all these commentators, and he doesn't seem to think that it's geographical. So we're mainly troubling the assumption that she's from Magdala. Of course, you know that I think she's from Bethany. So we're basically opening up the possibility that Jerome is correct and saying that it means that Mary is the tower, and Jerome says that she received the title tower for her faith. Yeah.
I very much look forward to reading the article, but I'm also wondering if you have thought about the possibility Magdala is actually the Hebrew version, not the Aramaic.
Magdala, yes, yes.
So the noun pattern, meaning tower, would be a word that you use for tower, but it doesn't have to be the place, right? So it would actually help your argument.
This is great. I mean, as I said, I am not an Aramaicist. I do know that Migdal is Hebrew and Magdala is Aramaic. And so it's obviously Aramaic Magdalene, which means like, ene means feminine.
Ending is a Greek ending, so it doesn't
right.
have anything to do with Aramaic.
She's Magdalitha in the Syriac manuscripts because it's like tower feminine, right?
Yes.
Magdalitha.
Yes,
Yeah, Joan Taylor is the Aramaicist. So I'm just kind of like, yeah, Joan, what Joan Taylor said.
I look forward to hearing.
Yeah, so.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Annalisa Sony, I speak Aramaic. And the personal thing is that Brendan Simonson also is a Vandy graduate.
Oh.
Of Vandy and my own student. So
Brandon is your student. That's why he's so smart. It's true. Brandon is like a genius. I was like, I got to get this guy. Oh my gosh. Well, I'll tell. That's so fantastic. I love Brandon. Nicest guy.
I'm going to go ahead and do an online question from Isabel Draper. In John 11, Mary and Martha and Mary have very different reactions to Jesus coming to see them after Lazarus' death. Martha maybe shows more obedience while Mary shows more anger at Jesus. How do the transcriptions with Martha deal with that? Is Martha's reaction completely removed, or is all of it attributed to Mary?
I would be interested in what verses exactly she's talking about, because they both say the same thing. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. They say identical things. So I'm wondering why one is more angry. Is it because Mary cries? So I don't know if Isabel would be willing to give the exact verse numbers and the exact text that she's referencing. One thing I should say is that because there is a verse where Martha interacts with Mary, John 11, verse 28, I'm arguing that if someone interpolated Martha, edited the text, that they authored that verse. The verse where Mary interacts with Martha would have been authored by the person who added Martha to the text. So again, there is no manuscript where Martha is completely absent. if we find one, it's going to be big news. Okay. I'm like, of these like 3,000 manuscripts I haven't looked at yet, like, do any of them not have Martha in them at all? So as of now, it's completely theoretical. It's theoretical. So I think that maybe where Isabel was going is, if you're suggesting that Martha wasn't there, how do you explain that there's differences in their presentation? And basically what I would say is that if my theory is correct, then there are parts that would have also been authored by this editor, specifically the part in between the duplicate quote. Something would have been like, the Christological confession is handed to Martha, but then there's an interaction between Mary and Martha that would have also had to be added. It's theoretical. I hope I answered Isabel's question. I want to know exactly where Mary gets angry at Jesus. I don't know.
From Siobhan Joy.
Hi, Siobhan.
Thanks for a great paper, Libby, on the subject of splitting and erasing women. Do you have any thoughts on the plural oldman in John 22? It's classic.
Oh,
John.
oidam. Yeah, oidamen. Yeah. Yeah, we do not know where they, it's when Mary Magdalene runs to Simon Peter and the other disciple, and she says, the tomb is empty, we do not know. I need to look at the Greek text, but yes, it is plural. And Siobhan, there are some manuscripts and a quote of Augustine where that is a singular verb. So again, it depends upon the manuscript. But you could also argue that John has access to Mark. A lot of people think John has access to Mark and even Matthew. And it might be like a subtle tip of the hat to like an acknowledgement that the author John is aware of other versions of the story where Mary went with other women, but John has particularly just said, I'm not going to mention them. I want to focus on Mary Magdalene. That's how I would see that. The author like knows a tradition where there's multiple women at the tomb, and that's why the plural verb is used there. But John wishes to emphasize Mary Magdalene in particular. And there are some manuscript variants there. Yeah.
Any questions?
Aren't manuscripts fun?
They're
the best.
Interesting. Thank Libby again for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And I want to encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. She also has some CDs. The music you heard when you came in was her Magdalene song. I'll play it during our reception. There's still more foods. Please stay around, talk to Libby and to all of our friends on Zoom and who will hear this afterwards. We really appreciate you participating and being with us today, and thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Yay! And thank all of you for coming. What a pleasure to do this in person. It's like a dream.